Hello, good morning, and good afternoon to those who join us for this presentation today. I'm always said morning and afternoon because I'm talking from the Pacific Coast, and I know some of you probably are from the East Coast and Central area to the United States. Thank you for taking the time to come and have this conversation about this in this time about the Northern Triangle geographical area in the American continent. Next, please. Next slide. As you can see, we have specific goals focus on the clinical needs of the indigenous population. And I want to make a parenthesis here. I use the term indigenous because it's the most common term used, even though it has some uh, controversial in the uses, but because literature and also academic use indigenous, I will use that in a specific in the presentation. We will try to understand the Northern Triangle, what is going on in this moment and historically, and at the same time, what's going on with the indigenous population that are living the Northern Triangle and migrate to different countries, especially the United States. Next, please. First, Northern Triangle, it's a geographic region in what is called Central America and is integrated by Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, as you can see in the darker. And this is in a specific, it's called Northern Triangle because these three countries, these nation states, has a common border at the peak of in the center. You see Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador have that common border. That's what is called the Northern Triangle. Now, according to the CDC, the Northern Triangle has a population roughly of 30 millions. And if you Google, you will see that Guatemala, for example, has more than 17 million in population right now, more than 9 millions Honduras, and more than 6 millions El Salvador. Then it's really roughly 30 million people living only in that part of the continent. From that population, we understood that the majority are Roman Catholics in respect to religion. Guatemala, 60% consider themselves Catholics, Honduras, 80%, and El Salvador, 57%. We have an increased numbers in Honduras and El Salvador. Guatemala and El Salvador, that becoming Protestant, and also that have no religion at all. Next, please. In another triangle, looking at different documents that we have, the Council of Foreign Relations established that approximately 265,000 left that specific three countries together annually in recent years. Now, since we can say 2016 that you're starting to hear more in the news about caravans and the Northern Triangle term, that probably doubled the number of people coming, and living the region. In 2018, USA granted asylum to roughly 13% of Northern Triangle applicants, which is the highest number in many years because usually is not that high of the number of granted asylum for people who come in from those regions. Currently, Guatemalans represent the largest numbers of migrant flow, followed by Hondurans and Salvadorians. Next, please. And as you can see in this table, Salvadoran, Guatemalans, and Honduras represent higher numbers Hispanic, Latinas, Latinos in the United States. And uh, most likely 1/3 of each of them are foreign born. The rest are second generation, third generations. But these are the most newest migrants that come into the United States. And even though the table present the Guatemalans and Honduras are, less larger than the Salvadorians here, now the migrants that we are starting to see more coming from Guatemala and Honduras, as I mentioned before. Next, please. Now, the Northern Triangle is particular in the sense of it's considered one of the poorest in the Western Hemisphere. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of violence, government corruption, and food insecurity are some of the majority of migrants mentioned as reason why they leave the region. The inside crime, which is a website that monitor crimes in different regions in the world, established that in 2018, the region is still at the top of the list of the deadliest world regions outside the war zone. What that means is if we consider war zone like a Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, where you expect high, crime or deaths, then outside those, the Northern Triangle is considered one of the deadliest one. Next slide, please. Now, one is the main reason this happened in Northern Triangle? Gangs. Gangs maintain control of areas in towns in these three different countries. They restrict the free pass of residents and non-residents. They, even control how the local governments can do things in those towns. Extortion is the main thing that they do. They extort anybody, from regular residents to business owners or anyone who goes into their territories. They force entry to the guns to young people, and if they don't do it, they retaliate with rape, beatings, and death, and different things. Now, how this become part of the reality is in the last, probably in the 90s, in the middle of the 90s, as you remember, the early 90s, most of the armed conflicts that Guatemala and El Salvador, for example, had ended. And through negotiation and agreements with the guerrilla and the governments, they stopped that conflict. However, after that, the United States started to deport some gang members, and as you saw in the different pictures, the previous and this one, mainly from what is called the Mara Salvatrucha and the 18th Street. Those gangs here, especially in California, which are the biggest ones, are rivals. And the United States is starting to deport these to the countries. And when they went into the countries, those remnants of the death squads in those countries are starting to combat those who were with tattoos. They're starting to identify people with tattoos as gang members, criminals coming from the United States, and they're starting to kill them. Then the gangs are starting to reorganize themselves and recruit, and that's how they grow. Now, gangs, we know, maintain the connection between those regional ones with the ones here in the United States, especially California. And I don't want to go deep into that because that's not the purpose of the presentation, but only let me tell you that the Mara Salvatrucha and 18th Street are part of the big corporation. They call it no, big guns corporations. The Mafia Mexicana has the control of these gangs. Then in Southern California, Mafia Mexicana is the big corporate gang like La Familia in Northern California. Then those has been the part of, they learned certain behaviors in California when they were deported and faced violence in their countries. They started to organize themselves, recruit, and starting to develop control of territory. Now, those countries are, regularly have high impunity. They do crimes and they're not persecuted. And most of the people lost faith in the authorities and institutions because even the police forces don't go. And when they put those gang members in the jail, they still have control inside the jail and continue, ordering scenes outside the jail. Therefore, also they have a highest femicide rates in the Latin America. This region has the biggest numbers of women killed, and most of those femicides are related to gang violence too, even though there's also include domestic violence and other reasons. But the increase in the numbers of women's killed is because of they reject or they don't want to be part of the gangs. Next, please. Now, the Northern Triangle has relationship to the United States that has not been too healthy. If we want to use a term, USA has policies for the region trying to have a control of the population and also the governments. And I don't want to give a long list of the different policies the United States have been having, but the most known ones, for if you look in the Google, you're going to see the Dominican Republic and Central America Free Trade Agreement. That was CAFTA, which was developed by the George Bush son presidency. And CAFTA was trying to have something similar to the agreement between Mexico, United States, and Canada. However, didn't work properly, and they started to notice that the war on drug was focused on South America, and Central America become like the bridge between the cartels in Colombia with the cartels in Mexico. Then because of that, they developed the Merida Initiative in order to fight drugs, and they release a lot of fundings to combat the drug, trafficking, instead of trying to help the governments to control the gangs. Then that one was changed later by the Obama administration to the Central American Regional Security Initiative, CARSI. This CARSI was almost $2 billion to the region to continually, focus on the drugs trafficking and minimizing some of the human trafficking too, but most focus on the drugs. Then also, Obama administration was known for court mandated removals. The Obama administration has the biggest number of deported immigrants for that region back to the countries. A lot of them gang members. Now, with the present administration that we have what they call it the zero tolerance policy. And recently, as you know, in the media, they call it national emergency. This creates situation of family separation, where we saw a lot of children coming and they were separated from their parents, and it still happen at this moment. Detention for long period of times with no resolution of their immigrant situation. Even though I said that in 2018 the number of asylums accepted were bigger, now we're starting to see more denials. The biggest percent are denial from asylum. And also we have seen deployment of the troops, National Guards in the borders, and new border barriers that are confronting and trying to stop what the government has saying is an invasion of immigrants, when we know that the mobilization of migrants from the whole region has been always the same. The only thing is now the media put more attention, and that's what you call about the caravans and these um, more view of people coming from that region to the United States. But remember also they not only come to the United States, they move to other countries within the region and also to Europe. Next, please. Now focus, now that we know what is the situation of the Northern Triangle and in the sense of the violence and the gun problem and also crime, we want to focus on the indigenous people. As you know, Central America is a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual region. And most of the people who work with Central Americans forget that most of the time, because we assume, and we have the label here as a Hispanic or Latino, we forget that we have this diversity in the region. Now, in general, we can say the mestizo society is considered in general patriarchal, where men are, that means men are the breadwinners and women are caregivers and responsible for the maintenance of the family life and tradition. And in certain degree, you can see also in the indigenous community. However, that change is different, depending on the community we're referring to. Next, please. Now, to be more specific, and these are more extended in a presentation that is focused on indigenous people in Guatemala, but roughly 60% of Guatemalans are considered Maya descendants. Many of those indigenous coming from Maya Quiche is one of the biggest groups. Cachiquel are the second one's moms, and Quechí are similar to the Cachiqueles, and they expanding recently in recent years. And other Mayas that include, different like Canjovales, Pocomams, Chols, all of those had another percentage. And one of the other population that usually we don't mention is and this is according to the Guatemalan demographic report in 2002, from the whole population of Guatemalans, 5,040 were Garifuna. Garifuna are Afro-Indigenous descendants. Then they are black in their color of skin, and that's present. Another thing that I will explain a little bit later, because this is related also with Honduras. Next, please. Honduras is widely considered a mestizo nation. They consider that only 7% of the population is indigenous, and 3 are either black or European white descendants. Most of them are considered mestizo. From the major indigenous groups in Honduras, the biggest one is Lenca, the Misquitos, the Garífunas, the Chortí, the Tolupan, Pechen, Tahuaca. Now, if you see in the map that you have, I don't know, you can distinguish a brown line in the Atlantic coast. Going to the Atlantic coast, that's a brown line in the whole Atlantic coast. That is the region of the Garífunas. And the Garífunas is a combination of African descendants with Caribs, from the Caribbean indigenous nations, and also with Mayas. Then that line that you see goes into Guatemala in the Atlantic part, where the Garífunas are more concentrated in Puerto Barrios. And this is an important scene, and I don't want to spend too much time in this, but I want to mention that most of the time people in the United States believe the African Americans is a situation that happened only in the United States. The slave trade happened more outside the United States, what is now United States. From the 50 millions on African slaves that were coming to the American continent, only 500,000 stay in what is now United States, and 14.5 millions stay in what's now we call Latin America. Then most of the Atlantic coast is known in all of the region as African descendants, and they mix with different indigenous population. Then the Garifuna specifically has been gained recognition by the United Nations as an Afro-Indigenous ethnic group in the continent. Then they are not considered just Afro-descendant, they are considered Afro-Indigenous. And the same happened with those in Mexico. This is not the topic, but in another opportunity, probably we can discuss about that. Then African descendants mixed with indigenous is important to take consideration, because you probably, if not now, soon you're gonna have people that are Black and they are from that region. Next, please. Now, in the case of El Salvador, again, this country considered the 80% of the population is mestizo. The biggest indigenous communities are the Nahua, the Lencas, and the Cacahuira. Even though there's are also Afro descendants and others groups, ethnic groups, and they are considered still a minority, all of them together. And for decades, not only El Salvador, but Honduras has been denied the existence of indigenous populations, especially El Salvador denied officially at the UN level that indigenous exists for many, many decades. And only until in 2010, they recognized officially at the Permanent Forum of Indigenous People in the United Nations that there exists indigenous communities. Now, this figure that you see here in your left side is the present government of Bukele has that as a part of you can open the government and you can see these indicating the languages speaking in this country. Now, that doesn't mean, and that's happened not only in El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. The governments, the actual governments, Yamatei, who's Italian descendant in Guatemala, Bukele, a Palestinian descendant in El Salvador, and Hov, mestizo in Honduras, don't have a really consideration of indigenous populations. They know they exist, but there's no real policies to have indigenous communities in their own countries. Next, please. Now, therefore, in Northern Triangle, it's common to understand that the indigenous people suffer widespread discrimination. Discrimination because if you said, for example, Indio, Indian, is an offensive word for anybody. If you wanna really offend someone, you call them Indios. And of course, they have been treated like they are ignorance, they don't have any culture, anything. Even when any indigenous person speak their own languages, they are, discriminated because of that. Also, we know that in these three countries, with some changes recently in Guatemala, disproportionate numbers of indigenous people live in extreme poverty compared to the general population. They live in rural areas where really extreme poverty. They don't have any assistance from the government. And for example, in El Salvador, until 2016, there was a constitutional amendment where they recognized the existence of indigenous communities, but that doesn't translate into benefits. Guatemala, who is considered a multicultural, multi-ethnic country, constitutional too, they had to be fighting for the rights too. Recently, Yamatei, an Italian descendant president of Guatemala, is starting to do a basis to the indigenous communities in Guatemala. And he is starting to offend the traditional leaders of the communities. And he was declared non grato and a person non grato in those communities, even though they want them to continue coming to confront him for his arrogance and also talking to them like they are ignorant people. Great number of indigenous people also from Guatemala and Honduras, therefore, are migrating. Honduras has more instability politically since the coup d'etat against Zelaya in 2009. It has been unstable, and recently, for example, Alenka woman Cáceres was assassinated, and also Garífunas has been, detained because they are in the front line to ask for the rights and look for more stability in their countries. Next, please. Due to high rates of femicide, like I said, in the region, and sexual and gender biased violence, from partners, from people, especially against indigenous women, they are in higher numbers migrating from that region because of it's impossible for them to continue living there. In 2010, an estimated of 80% of migrant women suffered rape during their journey through Mexico. They are trying to flee from these countries where they suffer a lot of violence, even death. And when they travel through Mexico, they are victims of rapes and other type of violence too during the journey. Then also there has been an increase in kidnapping and human trafficking. This is data from 2010, but we know that if you check more studies, recent studies, you're gonna see that is still something that is known, especially through the Mexico, when they go through Mexico. And because these gangs who are in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, the same gangs are also in southern Mexico. And they are the ones who create this kind of violence too. Next, please. Then when we talk about indigenous people, there's a language barriers and illiteracy, that increase the likelihood for indigenous women to be victims, and reduce the ability to ask for protection or report these type of crimes. Language barrier, because when we talk about Guatemala, we know there's 24 different languages, and most women's, will tend to speak in their language, not Spanish. But also those who speak Spanish, they don't read in Spanish. They can speak, but a lot of the time they have low literacy level in that language. They can read the language, but most of information will be written in Spanish, not in their own language. Then that made them really easy targets for violence during their going through their journey to the United States. Therefore, a lot of the indigenous women, when they decide to leave their countries, they try to hide their own ethnicity. They take off their traditional clothes, the refajos and huipiles, because those are identifying them where they come in, and they starting to put some regular clothes and learn more Spanish with the intonation of the region where they're gonna go. They're gonna learn ways to speak like a Mexican, and that's why trying to avoid a lot of or reduce a lot of those risks. In many cases unsuccessfully, but they continue doing that. That's why in footage that you see from the caravans, you don't see people dressing in their traditional clothes. Then most people believe they are all mestizos, when within that there's greater numbers of indigenous people coming. Next, please. Then when we work with indigenous people from the Northern Triangle, it is important to understand first that we need to distinguish indigenous people from other migrants. Because they are from Honduras, they are from El Salvador, from Guatemala, that doesn't mean they don't have their own culture, their own languages, their own traditions, that is totally different from the regular mestizo or national identity. In the region, after the independence, there's were a process to where there's a lot of violence, and they're starting to trying to reintegrate those, the Creoles starting to trying to get control over those new nations. And by the early 20th century, in the 1920s, they developed the mestizaje concept, that come from Vasconcelos, academic from Mexico, who talk about the La Raza de Bronce, the bronze race, that combination between, the indigenous and the European invaders. However, the concept of mestizaje has been more focused on how we made the population less indigenous and more like Europeans. And that has been the process where indigenous has been, really diminished in the sense of not making them invisible in the communities. Then when they migrate, most of us, when we see them, and we don't see that culture at the beginning, we assume that they are the common mestizos, and we started to label them as Latinos and Hispanics. Also, understanding of the language and cultural barriers is important, because a lot of them has been learning Spanish because they are forced to do that, not because they want. A lot of the education that has been implemented in this region is to teach them the Spanish, and they can eliminate the indigenous languages. A lot of languages have been lost in that process too. However, these communities still have a lot of cultural values and richness, because most of the people, even if they don't speak their own language, they still have that cultural richness in themselves, on how they express themselves, how they act, how they see things, different than the what we call it the Occidental point of view that we have in the United States. Also, it's important to understand the deep trauma indigenous migrant experience. First, the trauma starts in their country origin, like I said, discrimination, and also trying for them to cut what is the indigenous inside of them, and making them more like the national ideal of that nation state. Then the invisibility is part of that, but also the process of education and the pressure in the society that they need to lose everything that is indigenous in themselves. Then that's part of, growing in that situation is a trauma. Those of you who were in the mental health field, that deep trauma that coming is intergenerational, because this is not happening right now. It has been happening since the invasion for more than 500 years. Then they have that trauma coming with themselves. Then when they trying to integrate themselves, some of them, because they move from their towns to the cities, they suffer discrimination for the way they speak, for the way they act, for the way they dress. And then that's another trauma that they had to confront. When they leave the country, they have to go through, borders that cause them another trauma. Crossing borders, it's another thing, because if they use the Spanish dialect in the region, you're gonna hear that, for example, it's easy to confuse an Honduran from an Salvadorian, because they almost speak with the same intonation and the same words in the Spanish dialect, but it's different when you go to Guatemala. They probably use the same type of words, but the intonation is different. Then crossing the border is part of the trauma. When they go to Mexico, Mexico has a different intonation, is a different dialect to the Spanish, and they are easily recognized and target from those who want to cause violence on them. Then that's something that happened, and is part of the trauma, going through, too many days, or sometimes walking, sometimes sleeping, not in really places to live, but outside. It's hard, it's traumatic for children and for adults. And when they come finally to the border with the United States, it's another extra trauma, because first a lot of them has to sell everything they own in their country to pay for this traveling. And when they come to the border, they don't have anything. Then that's why they have been using as mules to cross drugs. They are raped. They had different type of violence. Then a lot of them, when they cross the border with the United States, they have all that accumulated trauma. And then when they face and confront border patrol in the United States, and they are put in detention and treated as a criminals, that's an extra trauma. Then that's why I said it's a deep trauma that indigenous population for the North Triangle experience, not only in their countries, but also traveling outside their countries and coming to the United States. And when they are here in the United States, they are confused because, first they are called Latinos, Latinas, or Hispanics. Their languages are called dialects when they are languages. For indigenous people like me, when you said my language is a dialect, it's an offense, because my language is a complete language. It's not a variation of another language. And many of the languages spoken in this region are complete languages. They are not dialect like the Spanish the region speak. That is a variation of the Castilian that come or other ones, Creole, for example, for some of the Garifuna. Then this is something that we see a lot. The trauma that coming people bring to these in this traveling and coming to the United States is experience, not only for children but for adults and young people. Then in general terms, indigenous people will not trust Occidental medical, mental, and social services providers. They had already a trauma coming from their countries. Then when they face discrimination here in the United States, of course, anyone that represent the society that it's rejecting them, they will not trust naturally those, even though you want to help and you want a good faith to help, they will not see it at the beginning. Next, please. Then it is important to also understand what I have been explaining to you, that indigenous migrants have a high risk of re-trauma. Why? Because as I said, they suffer discrimination in their countries of origin. They suffer discrimination and violence, and in where they're traveling through the different borders. And when they come here to the United States, they face first the system, the border patrol, detention, the court system, that is really not friendly for a lot of migrants, especially in the actual situation that we live in right now. And then when they are, for some reason, they are released into the communities, they face again discrimination. And the retrauma is because those gangs who were the origin of them living are, for example, in California, they will see again in the communities where they're gonna go to live, with relatives or friends, they are gonna see Mara Salvatrucha and 18th Street gangs too. And they are rivals. They have, that violence in the inner cities, especially Los Angeles County. It's they will experience again that kind of trauma that they experience in their country. Also because, and I mentioned this in previous conversations, also because they are coming from Guatemala or from Honduras, they are, they are discriminated if they don't speak fluently Spanish because they want to speak their own languages, or if they have a different way to see things, they won't feel that discrimination. They will be treated like a little children, and that's something that is common, and we hope that we learn about that in this process of the conversation that we have. Also, because if they identify themselves as an indigenous person, Maya or Garifuna, for example, especially Garifunas suffer a lot because they are a dark skin, they're black, they look black, they are African Americans, they are coming from this region, and people see them in a different way too. A lot of those who now consider themselves Latinos or Hispanics here in the United States see them as more, this discriminatory way, and a lot of the Garifunas I had, an experience working with Belizeans and from Puerto Barrios in one of the high school in Los Angeles, in South Los Angeles, and they always said that they feel discriminated because Central Americans don't recognize them as a Central American because they're black, and the Afro Americans don't recognize them because they are from Central America, and they don't speak the English like African Americans. Then they had in this, situation where they don't feel connection with anybody, they try to look connection from within themselves. Then it's a re-trauma again, because discriminations in the um, origin countries, discrimination going through the migration process, and discrimination when they reach a point where they are want to stay. Then it has been really it's really complex, that trauma they experience um, when they face different populations here in the United States. Therefore, depression is really high because they feel isolated coming to the United States. They feel that they cannot communicate properly. They cannot have, you know, a regular living condition that they had before. They had that, missing their relatives, missing their towns, their familiar way of life. Depression is really one of the high risks for indigenous migrants. Also, because of that, in a previous conversation, I explained that indigenous people tends to live in crowded spaces. Not necessarily they live with relatives or with friends, but it someone speak their own language and they identify that as the common thing, they tend to support each other and living together. Then in an apartment or a small space, you're gonna see different people living together. There's no privacy. There's no way to maintain certain distance between them. Therefore, the increase of domestic violence could happen if there's couples living together. Neglect or abuse to children too is an increased incidence in those situations. And plus the substance abuse. Alcohol and drugs are available in the inner communities where they're gonna live, and because of the depression, the trauma they have, they try to numb themselves in a certain way, and usually they're gonna have access to substance, drugs and alcohol, and they will start using it. And with increased use, domestic violence is major. And as you know, alcohol and drugs increase the depression too. We started to see also some increase in suicide um, in these communities. And it's something that we need to put attention when you provide services to the indigenous people from the Northern Triangle. Many indigenous also people come from extreme poverty living conditions. That means that they probably don't have public and social services provided by the government. They don't have access to clinics, not mental health. They don't have also assistance with, and they don't trust really government institutions. Then when they come to the United States, they will tend to not understand why, for example, the children needs to go to the school. When in their countries probably they don't have schools, they had to develop their own schools. They have to create their own spaces. And here is by law, they have to send their children to the schools. And that's create another conflict too and another trauma. Some of these children are gonna grow learning English and they will tend to prefer, to speak in English than, communicate the way they communicated before they come to the United States because of the pressure they have, the bullying they experience in school too. Um, at least here in California, we can see that. Then we need to keep in mind that that is something that you will see in communities who are coming from indigenous backgrounds in that sense. Also, because the conceptualization of disease and health is different. Indigenous people will look for traditional healers to resolve medical and mental concerns. And I want only to not expand too much on that, but what we call a cosmovision is how we perceive the world and how we're integrated in the world is a completely different than the what we call it the Occidental point of view. Disease is a cultural understanding. For indigenous people, diseases, either physical or mental, has a different origin than what we in the Occidental point of view consider in the scientific rational way. and it's easy for a lot of providers here in United States to, for example, if someone said, can I do a pray? They accepted more than if they said, can I, do an smudge? They want to see it like, well, what is that? That's a witchcraft, something. We're starting to put labels because we don't understand that different on point of view. World views are completely different. Then we need to understand that indigenous people coming, even if they don't have any more their own language, they coming with that different view, world view of what the disease and mental diseases are and how they can resolve it in the best way. Next, please. Then it is important to train providers in cultural competence and understanding of the diversity of the region. And this is not only you as a mental provider or medical provider, but also any level of staff, receptionists, people who are doing intakes, those who do home visiting. It's important that they understand, sorry, that even though indigenous people coming from Honduras, Guatemala, or El Salvador, they would be different. There's a diversity. There's a cultural heritage rich that it's gonna be always there. Also, for example, in the food, that's an important thing that we need to remember. Food for a lot of people, when they think about Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras, they have just a specific type of food that they believe that's the common thing. But remember, indigenous has more richness in that, and they will tell you, oh yeah, I know that, but we eat this. Then diversity is important to understand them from that factor. Also, because they are black, like you see in the picture, that doesn't mean they are Afro-Americans. They are from that region, and Afro-Indigenous people that has their own cultural richness too, their own languages, their own traditions, their own way of see the world. Then it's important that organizations that work with indigenous populations identify local community organizations, and that's something that you could do in your state, in your county. Look for those organizations that represent these communities. Um, Look for traditional healers too, because most likely indigenous people will look for those traditional healers first than anything else. They're not gonna go and look for other services if first they're gonna look for a traditional healer. Now, in a previous presentation, I mentioned that the most common places where you find traditional healers are called botanicas. And the botanica it's a space where there's traditional healers. Some of them are probably not real healers, but there's others that are really real healers. And those botanicas sell herbs, things different, candles, different things that indigenous community use in their own traditions. Then it's an opportunity to identify any of those botanicas in your local areas that you approach them and see, how these communities coming to them, and develop that relationship will help to get trust of those community members. Churches, as you remember in the beginning, I mentioned most of people from Northern Triangle consider themselves, Catholics. Then the Catholic Church has, for example, a Maya pastoral is called, dedicated to all Mayas, not only from Guatemala, but also Mayas from Honduras, Mayas from Mexico. That's a broad, spectrum of Mayas, this people that they work with. Um, Different churches you can find also locally where they are going. And in this sense, you know, part of what's happened with the Catholic Church is what we call a syncretism. You know, celebrations that a lot of communities in their country of origin have that combine the indigenous with the Catholic tradition, and that's why they can maintain their own traditions. Because during the colonial period, they were repressed, then they hide their own traditions under the Catholic things. You know, that's why you're gonna see they have saints, they have virgins, and they celebrate, and their celebrations are particularly that syncretism will show up. You know, with dances, with how they dress, how they act, and how they represent things during those festivities. One of the biggest festivities in most of the Northern Triangle is the Holy Week. You know, that's something that it's noticeable, and also the Day of the Dead is big in that region. Then during those times, you can see how indigenous people will go and participate in activities around churches or community organizations. And that's where you will identify, you know, those gatekeepers in the community, and you can have that communication with them, establish that relationship. Also, remember, um, Guatemalans and Salvadorians starting to increase to participate in Protestant churches. And it's important to see where they're going, you know, which Protestant churches are open to provide services. I will say, in my experience, those Protestant churches who are more open to do ecumenical work are more open to work in a different way too. Those who doesn't like the ecumenical work will be more, you know, not really open to services, but it's depend on the pastor and the church, and you can explore those things. Also, most of indigenous people, because they celebrate, you know, specific dates in for them to remember their hometowns, they tend to meet within hometown networks. You know, for example, if they come from San Pedro Sula, you're gonna have the San Pedro Sula um, neighbor association. If they coming from I don't know, Morazan in El Salvador, you're gonna see, depending on the town, Guatajiagua is gonna have people only from that town. In the case of Guatemalans, you're gonna see from Santiago Titlan Association. You know, they tend to do that because, like I said, you know, they look for familiar languages and traditions, and that's why they can continue celebrating. If you identify those hometown networks, that's a good way to connect with indigenous people, to go and starting to develop that trust, you know, starting to see what their needs are, what the perception is of the needs, and based on that, starting to establish and offering the services that you wanted to provide to those communities. Also, it is important to create safe spaces for indigenous people, because, like I said, most of the time they feel discrimination. They feel that they are putting aside. They feel that they don't value as a human beings. You know, invisibility has been so, um, you know, the common sin in the country of origin, that one time, you know, people ask why indigenous people use those colorful, you know, trajes, you know, that traditional clothes. And I remember one elder from the Cachiquele said, well, we use these colors because they don't see us. Then at least they can see the colors of our clothes. And that's one of the reasons, you know, other than you know, in their tejidos, in their weaving, they weave their traditions and their history and their culture too. You know, you can read different things in their weaving, but that's a different topic that I don't want to go to that. Then creating safe spaces is important, because they need to feel that they are welcome, that they are treated with respect, that they are not confused with other mestizo migrants, that people respect them because they are, they have their own cosmovision, their own ways of doing things. And if you create that safe space, that will be the best way to connect with those communities. Then that's why I recommend the development of intercultural projects. And in this sense, oh, sorry, I needed some liquid in my throat. Intercultural projects, it's something that is starting to happen in the region, and some effort has been doing, at least in California, with some kind of success, because intercultural means that you recognize indigenous people coming from different, worldview that you have here in the United States, and trying to provide services. You need to understand that those two views need to find a common point. Then the idea is to, for example, there has been an effort to have in clinics, not only the medical provider, but within a curandero or curandera. And that's way the person feel that is in a more holistic way, they're seeing their problems. With mental health providers also, it has been some ideas, some now therapies coming from the concept of we need to have a compadre, comadre, um, type of view. And that's something that is more cultural in a sense. There has been, for example, I know Arizona, New Mexico, universities that putting together, or even in Healing, California, UCLA has courses on curanderismo, where they discuss the, you know, worldviews and how you perceive concepts like mal de ojo, empacho, and also how you perceive mental health issues as different levels of susto, and how the treatment that we trying to provide from the Occidental point of view doesn't really make an impact in these communities. But when you combine it with the traditional healing ways, that help and that make a change, because the way a curandero is gonna discuss this perception is different than you as a therapist or a doctor is gonna discuss it with the patient. Then it's a more familiar way, and if you could, as an organization, can develop that collaboration and intercultural projects, and if you see it's working, will help a lot indigenous people to thrive and also to heal, because that's the purpose that most of you have, how you can help people to heal and not imposing your agenda or your point of view, but seeing from themselves, and in that process of healing, learning at the same time to be more sensitive to that. Then with that, we open to any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier, for that awesome presentation. Just make sure I can see the question part. Okay, so the first question, I think is regarding when you started the whole presentation, and it says, what would be a more appropriate term for indigenous?
That's when I always go to the questions, I think it's always wonderful questions, and sometimes the answer I trying to put it shorter, but it's in a short way, but it's really Um, we need more time to that, but let me explain this. Indigenous is a term that in literature and academia is accepted at this point, and a lot of indigenous people tend to accept that in a certain way. But most of the time, people will like you to refer them as their First Nation that they belong to. Like for example, if someone tell you I'm a Cachiquel, they will prefer that you refer them as a Cachiquel person than a Maya, for example, or an indigenous person. And if they are more specific, like for example, they can tell you I'm a Cachiquel Tzotzil. The Garifuna will prefer to be called Garifunas too, because they fight many years to get recognition for UN, and UN recognize them as a Afro-Indigenous. Then Garifuna is an official term at the UN. Then they would like to have people respect them in that sense. A Lenca person will prefer that you call them Lencas, and or at least related to the town they belong to. They will tell you, I'm a Cachica from Solola. I'm a Garifuna you know, from saying gracias a Dios. Then that's the department. But in a specific town, they will mention that. And they will feel comfortable with that more than if you call them Hondurans, Salvadorans, Guatemalans, or Latinos or Hispanics. In reality, for example, in my personal view, and this is not, UC Caribe, but my personal view, and I was explaining to my colleagues here, if someone call me Latino, Hispanic, I feel offended, because I'm an indigenous person and I know that I'm Lenca Nahuatl. I would prefer for them to call me Cushcateco, if you want to say it in Castilian. Um, but I know it's difficult to say it. Then if someone say, "Oh, you're now what Lenca," I'm fine with that. Then the best way to do that is ask them how they recognize themselves, how they feel comfortable to be called. Because that's the best way. And different community has different way to name themselves. Um, then don't assume things. That's will be my general recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. Our next question is regarding when you talk about the gangs, and it says, what has been done or what can be done about problem gangs pose to communities, countries, and people?
That's a complex question and answer. Um, Even though this is not the focus of the presentation, as I said before, I think the guns violence is one of the key things for what people is living the region. And this has been considered by academics and people in the region as well as here in the United States that was the problem with the guns was a product of the deportation the United States did. Then United States create that problem. And only let me be not deep in that, but let me tell you this. Mara Salvatrucha, for example, that gang, was created in California, in Los Angeles specifically, first by Salvadorians who came fleeing El Salvador from the conflict, the armed conflict. Then when they came to LA, Mexicans started to, harass them. Then they formed the Mara Salvatrucha because for a Salvadorian said Salvatrucho is kind of, a national connotation, and Mara was a word common. Mara means a group of people. Then that's why they call themselves Mara Salvatrucha. From that evolved into more violent situations. When they were adopted or integrated to the big corporation, like I mentioned, the Mafia Mexicana, they become Mara Salvatrucha 13. Because remember, the 13 letter in the alphabet is the M. Then that was the meaning that they were part of the Mafia Mexicana. Then the gun 18th Street was more Mexican based in the beginning, but then because the diversity in Los Angeles, they become to start integrating people from different countries. There are Mara Salvatrucha members who are from South America too. There are even from the Caribbean countries too. Then it's no longer particular nationality. Then when you send them, deport them to a situation where there's violence, and they starting to act and see, okay, we have to defend ourselves here in California. Now we go back to our countries and we need to defend ourselves there. You're starting to create a situation where they are going to be seen as different. There's a really because of the conflict, there are conflicts create, a really all the social network in those countries were destroyed completely. Then it was the right condition for these gangs to grow. Then as soon they started to growing, and the drug traffickers were looking for different ways to transport, and you enter in that trafficking of drugs and human trafficking, then you starting to create money and power. Then if United States really wants to try to resolve, we need to see different ways. Like, for example, there have been efforts with, for example, there's Homies Unidos. There's an organization, created by Father Boyle. There is Homies Industries, they're trying to not to say, okay, you're in a gun, you're a bad person, but how you can use what you learn, to be like a family working together and leave the violence aside and working toward a different purpose. Then it's really we need to look for different ways. Each country has to identify ways to minimize, the violence, and at the same time how they can integrate young people to healthy ways of, be part of the society. Then it's more complex. I know I cannot discuss everything in this short time, but I think that's something that each of you in your communities need to start thinking about. How if you have a gun problem, how some of these have been solved in a different way. Los Angeles is trying to do a different approaches, not only, repressing, violence, but also intervene. We have GRIDS program, who are gun prevention programs. And, in a certain way, we're trying to change that culture of violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. The next question said, I had heard this term referred to Guatemala indigenous communities for Latinos, and the term it's quoted, it says Indio Chuco, and it says it sounds very hurtful. Can you explain this, how the term creates trauma? I guess they're asking if it's like a hurtful term, and how does that work in terms of like trauma and hurting the one that receives the term, I guess.
Yeah, I think in the Hispanic dialect that we speak in the region, language is really discriminatory in that sense, because it's not only Indio Chuco, they use also, and I'm sorry, I'm gonna use these words in Spanish that I don't know if there is a translation, what is called pata rajada, um, there's terms like Maria, these are the Marias, and it's a despective way to say it. It's an offensive to call, some others call it niño, niña, or they use like, oh, marillita, and those are discriminatory ways to refer to an indigenous person. And indigenous people live with this. They know what they're referring to that is a way to insult them, you know. Um, Others are more bold in the sense of saying, ignorant or ignorant Indian or ignorant, but they use different terms. Then that has been an experience, and between the mestizos is a way to insult to each other too. Between the mestizos, if you want to offend someone, you call them Indio sucio, and dirty Indian, and that's way, they are considered less. Then it's an offense that can, create a lot of violence between people. And, they use it because, like, for example, I explained in the case of Yamatei, the president of Guatemala, he was offended when the traditional authorities or the caciqueles were telling him this is the situation and we are, telling you this is happening. And he was saying, no, that's not true. That's the problem for all the government, not my government, and you're insulting me. He was arrogant in that sense because for most of the mestizos, indigenous people are less than human in the sense of how they treat. If you have the opportunity, I will invite you to buy the testimony of Rigoberta Menchú. It's called I, Rigoberta Menchú. It's from 1982, but whatever you read there and how she expressed her experience working with Latinos are mestizos. There's other term that is more used between indigenous people. We call it caslanes to the Latinos. That you know uh, you can see in that story, and if you read it, how even the mestizos who are poor, like the indigenous, consider themselves better because they are not indigenous. Then, and you imagine also with the Afro-indigenous how that is more deeper. Then something that we don't discuss a lot is about the Afro descendants and indigenous people in our regions. We focus too much on the mestizos, but we don't see all the discrimination, the trauma we cause, and the invisibility that we create from our indigenous communities and Afro-indigenous, and how we treat it in those countries. And when they come here, how they face the same thing from others who consider themselves here Latinos or Hispanics. If you are second, third generation here, you will see them in a different way too. I don't know if that's respond, but it's I try to. But I invite the person to and anybody to buy the book if you have not read it yet. I Rigoberta Menchú is called. Thank you.
That's perfect because someone asked about books that you would recommend for learning more about the topic. So that was on point. Um, okay. So next question says, would you say that illness and healing is tied to the spiritual?
Like I said, it's a the concept of disease and healing is based on culture, and culture imply different things. Like when I mentioned cosmovision, it's a worldview that integrate many things. For example, even though we are different indigenous communities with different languages, in an essence, we have a conceptualization. I don't know if you can see here. We use colors. You can see the red, the black, the yellow, and white. Those are colors that normally you're gonna see in Northern Triangle tradition in southern Mexico, because those are more related with what we call the Maya cosmovision. How we perceive the directions around us. Then when we call it spiritual is how we integrate for us our ancestral heritage and the energies that coming with, for indigenous community, we understand the energies in a world act in a way that can help us or affect us. Then anything that come into understanding mental health issues or physical issues has to be around that too. Then when they use, for example, in the case of the Mayan Akeh, or when they use a curandero, this person is going to look at first, what is the situation, their families, when they born, in which day they born, at what time, all of that is integrated into the perception of the what we call a disease in order to have a better treatment for healing. Then yes, it will imply a lot, and because some also communities integrate some part of that Christian beliefs into the syncretism that I mentioned before, you're gonna see that also they're gonna have santos, they're gonna have a virgin, and they're gonna have a rezo within the healing process too. Some other communities will use crystal. Some other communities will use limpias, for example, with specific herbs that they made, and they would use alcohol, or different other things, agua florida, siete machos, etc. Then smudging is part of that process, and have a spiritual connotation too, not just physically. Then to have a more holistic way to perceive is important for an indigenous person than seeing just from the perspective that we in an Occidental mentality have on the scientific and rational way. You have a mental, because you have a trauma and that's it, but we don't perceive the person most as a whole. Then having that holistic point of view is important when you treat communities who have indigenous background. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. Our last question to wrap everything up says, are there generalities regarding parenting philosophies among the indigenous people?
Can you repeat that part of the generalities about parenting?
Yeah, regarding parenting philosophies. I guess they're trying to know what's like the difference on how indigenous people would do parenting opposed to American styles.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Like I said, it's a culture, it's a different view of the world completely. How you perceive the relationship between women and men. When I mention about patriarchal ways of view, is more common on the mestizos than in a lot of indigenous communities. Women has an important role, not only as a caregiver, but also as a leaders in the communities. For the Lenca communities, by giving an example, women's have a leading role. They are the head of the household, not the men. Then for most of the people, because they coming from the concept of patriarchal, they try to, develop conversation with the male in the family when, and this you can see also in some Zapotec communities and Triquis, women's are the head of the household, but when people don't understand that, they don't see it. Therefore, also children has a role in this construction of the world. In many meetings, in many communities, when everyone is speaking, children can speak too, and they have their space to say the word. And it's respected, like an adult, like an elder, a young person has. Then they have spaces to express themselves. The way they are raised also, um, like I said, most of indigenous communities live, you know, under the poverty levels of most of the common populations in the country of origin, especially in El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua, and Guatemala. Um, Children learn how to, have more responsibility as adult in early age. By age, say 8, they already know how to work, how to take care of their younger siblings, how to support the parents. Then when they are like 13, they already have a more adult mentality in that sense. And and if you read, for example, Rigoberta Menchú narration, and she explained about that, how they working in the fincas, the haciendas, and picking the coffee, the sugar cane, the cotton. They learn to become adults in an early age, because of that process, that happened. And in that sense, I'm not gonna say it's perfect, because the communities are a lot are permeated by these patriarchal point of views too, where because of a lot of the frustration, discrimination, um, when they go to the fincas, the haciendas, alcohol is accessible to them, and alcoholism is high. Then domestic violence abuse happen too. Then we need to understand that yes, there is a different point of views, but there's also still an influence from the dominant society to certain things. But in that process, they learn. There's things that community has been changing in the process. Women's taking more role now and showing the leadership they have. And we hope that the same way children will be perceived in a different way when you have contact with the indigenous communities here. Um, I don't. It's time, I know, and I don't want to expand more, but I hope that you can explore, through the book of Rigoberta more of that. You're gonna see how also pregnancy is seen in a different way than most people. How that and loss and all of that process too is perceived in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. And I also wanted to mention that I copied the full name of the book, because some people were asking for it again, so you have it on the chat. And I wanted to remind everybody that the event that's going to be on July 30th is a case discussion of a Salvadorian female youth using trauma-focused cognitive behavioral health, theory. So I just wanted to mention that because some people may have noticed that we did not discuss anything that was clinical. We're saving all those questions for that specific event. So I just wanted to give out that reminder. As always, Javier, thank you so much for your time. We had a lot of questions and people were very much into the whole topic and very curious about it as well. Um, if you have anything else that you want to have answered, feel free to write us to our email. I know some of the questions weren't answered. And you have our info on the screen, so please make sure you write to us if you need anything else. And with that, I think we can conclude today's webinar. I don't know if Javier, you want to say something before we go?
Only thank you so much for coming to this conversation. I hope that you learned something today and you will keep in mind that when you want to work with indigenous communities, learn about them first. And then you're going to feel more confident to approach any ways that you want to develop a relationship with indigenous community. Thank you. for your attention and thank you for your participation. And enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, Javier, and everybody have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.